way. So,
I know.
okay, thank you.
So then, I will turn on the live stream now. And so then I guess, Maddie, then do you want to, like right at 1:30, just start us off then?
Yes, I can do that.
Hey,
Perfect.
are you seeing on the right-hand side like some folders and things?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so if I scroll, now it's just the website, right?
No, you would have to close that sidebar if you don't want it to be visible.
No, I want the one on the left.
Oh,
But
I
the one
can't.
on the right, did you see one on the right? Maybe you didn't.
No, can't see
Okay,
any.
all right. Oh, okay, there's a green bar around everything that's being shared, so that's
Yep.
good. Okay,
All right, I'm going to start the live stream now.
all right. 1 minute early. So we're waiting for folks to come in, I'm assuming. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we'll wait and see. I'm sure sometimes folks, there's a bit of a delay or folks are jumping around or deciding which session to go to.
Yeah. Right now I see nobody in, right? Except for the
Right.
three of us. Okay,
Yep.
good. Yeah. So I think there's like 7 things going on right now. So wouldn't be surprised if this was not the most popular. And you'll do a quick introduction, then I'm on. Is that how it works?
Yep, I'll welcome everyone, introduce you, and just say the title of your talk, and then you can.
Perfect. Okay, then I'll know when to start. Do you have to let people in? So people are in event Moby right now, correct?
So it's not like a regular Zoom, right, Michelle? They don't have to be let in. They can just.
They are watching right now.
All right.
So does streaming, so we're ready to go.
Oh, okay. So there are people in event Moby ready for this to happen. Okay.
Oh, that's my mistake then. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Sorry for listening to our shop talk there. Thanks for joining in today. Today we have Tracy Hames, who's the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Wetlands Association, and he's here to talk about watershed scale protection and restoration, and to go through some basic planning approaches and tools that are available to you all. And you may use the Q&A as we go through the presentation to ask questions, and we will interject and have Tracy answer the questions as we go. And please upvote questions that you feel are something you really want to hear an answer to. So take it away, Tracy.
Good afternoon. Nice to see everybody, even though I can't see you. Today we're actually operating without a net. This is not a PowerPoint. We'll all be on the internet scrolling around looking at some different websites that provide useful planning and assessment information for folks that are interested in looking at wetlands and wetland restoration or management or any kind of those types of questions. So bear with us. You'll literally be taking a journey with me through these sites, and I'll be talking as we go about what types of things are available. And as we're looking at these sites, talking about how to think about wetland restoration and some of the approaches you might take as we look around the world here. I'll be using an area just south of Stevens Point called the Little Plover River Watershed as an example because we've done a lot of work. We're doing work up in that area right now, and I've done a lot of visited that area with these websites in the past, and so there's things previously available. So let's dive in. I want to start out with saying that most of the information that I'm presenting today can also be found, the links to the websites and things, on the Wisconsin Wetlands Association's webpage, wisconsinwetlands.org. And a lot of the things that when we're looking at it, up here on our website where it says learn, and there's some for landowners section, learning about wetlands, caring for your wetlands, landowner handbook and resources. A lot of the sites I'll be going to today have links on our website. There's a lot on our website to learn about wetlands and just a lot of different things. So I would encourage everybody to visit our website, and hopefully it will help you understand how to look at wetlands, why they're important, and what we can do to restore and care for them. So I will start out with Google Earth. That is a basic tool that really helps show folks. And Maddie, is Google Earth showing on the screen?
Not yet, Tracy.
It's not. It should be up there. I wonder if it's not being shared somehow. If that's the case, we'll have to skip Google Earth and not go through it that way.
Is it on, do you have two screens?
It's on my screen. Yeah, it's on a second.
So you might have to click and drag it into that box of the highlighted yellow green.
Okay, it's over top the highlighted yellow green. Sorry, folks, we are operating without a net here. This is brand new stuff, and you don't see it now, do you?
No.
Okay. Let me close that out, and I will see if I can open it through Safari here. Google Earth is a really useful tool that really helps you look at anywhere, and there's just so many different things. It's a series of aerial photos that are all rectified. Can you see it now? View of the Earth?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So I have it downloaded on my my laptop or on my computer, but we're going to be using it now where I'm not logged in. So this may be a little bit different than we're normally doing. So how do I then, what I want to do is find Plover, Wisconsin. And I know on my regular Google Earth, I just type in Plover, Wisconsin, and it shows, and it goes right to the location. So what I would encourage everybody to do, if you want to use Google Earth, go onto the Google Earth website and download it onto your computer, and it's much more user-friendly. And then you'll have it as an application on your computer. So here we are. This is Stevens Point. This is Plover right here. We're going to be looking in at the Little Plover River. So here's the Wisconsin River coming down on the left. This is the Little Plover River right here. This is the Little Plover River watershed. Can you see my cursor circling around, Maddie?
Yep. I would maybe
moved
do
my
once
cursor?
more, a little slower.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you can see it. Okay,
Mhm.
great. So here we are looking at an aerial photo of Google Earth, and I'm not sure on this version, there's several features on Google Earth that are really handy that I can talk about, but I don't think we'll be able to access because this is not a downloaded application of the version. So a couple of the features they have when you download Google Earth, you'll have up in the upper right or left corner, you'll have a series of icons that allow you to either print or, oh, maybe this is it. No, I don't know what that is. anyways, you can print out a screen photo of what's on your screen. They actually even have photos going back several years, usually till about 1992, and they're all rectified. So if you're looking at a scene, you can go back and look at what that looked like in 2005, all the way back to usually about 1992, and they're super useful. So let's see what we can see on aerial photos. So here we are, Little Plover River. Little Plover River is a river. It's not really a river. It's a stream or a creek. It's about 5 miles long. It starts right here and flows down into the Wisconsin River. This area here is a terminal moraine, and behind that is a submarine, not a submarine, submarine. And a lot of the Little Plover River is groundwater fed by water that's expressing, especially at the base of this moraine here. So let's scroll in a little bit and talk about what we can see, and talk a little bit about how you can use aerial photos to learn about different features. So as you can see here, it's hard to tell, but this is the Little Plover River coming through. This, for reference, is a road called Kennedy Avenue. And I want people to look at this feature right here, because we'll look at this on several other videos as well. This is an agricultural field with a drain coming up here, and see it's kind of got this weird rectangular shape. This is the very tippy top of Little Plover River. It flows on down, goes down this direction, and then there are a few other branches coming off the base of the moraine that feed into the river as well. So when you're looking at a modern aerial photo, what do we see? Okay, first we see a very forested moraine, and pretty dense forest in this area as well. And remember that. Remember how thick this forest is here and in here. Here you see agricultural fields, features like this. That's an irrigation wheel line, a circle irrigation. You can see the circles around here. That's telling you that this is an irrigated crop field, and the same with this. See those lines there. Obviously, some of these are hay fields. Some things you can see are crop fields. Let's scroll way on in and look at what you can see in this field here. So you see a bunch of blank areas where they've been farming, but the crops didn't grow very well right there. This is important because what these are is wet areas on the agricultural field. So as you're scrolling around, you see a lot of these types of things, and you think, well, something's going on there. Well, maybe that's an indication that things are really wet in that portion of the fields there, and maybe we're looking at some wetland soils. This is an agricultural drain. It's hard to tell because of the trees, but we'll see on some other mapping sites that the drain comes down, starts way up on the top, flows down, cuts across right here, cuts over, and then downstream. And this agricultural drain actually enters the Little Plover River at the bridge right here on Kennedy Avenue. You see this is the Little Plover River itself. Goes up this way here, and it literally, the tippy top, the headwaters of the river itself is right here. Look at, here's the river, and that ag drain I was telling you about is right here. So we're going to be talking a lot about this area here, and what we can learn, and how we can think about restoring this headwaters area. What we've got, and remembering these, we're looking at some basic online web tools that you can use to help planning, but there's no substitute for boots on the ground. And boots on the ground, allows me to know that this drainage ditch here is deep enough where it's probably about 5 or 6 feet in elevation lower than the river itself. So when the river's right here and the drain's right here, and this is lower than this, what do you think is going to happen? It's pulling groundwater out of the river into this drain, and allowing groundwater to bypass the upper portion of the river, go down along the road, and re-enter the river downstream. And this whole area here is about a mile, a little more than a mile. So what we're finding out is this area is literally draining the area up here. Now, when you see thick trees like this, you also know that it's probably fairly dry as well, because dense, unless it's a swamp, real dense swamp, thick trees like this don't grow in really, really wet areas. Here's an area that's more open. There's probably less, it's probably a wetter site. And we'll revisit all these sites later as we go. So this area here is probably much more wet because the trees aren't growing as well. Obviously, this area is cultivated, probably hayed. Actually, I know it's hayed, and that's why there's no vegetation there. Now, also look at this feature here. There's a funny little diagonal line going right up the way here. And we're going to revisit that later as well. It stops here, but what is that thing? It's not a power line. And it actually, it's kind of hard to see, but it goes up the hill as well. So we'll be revisiting that and trying to figure out what that thing is as well. So a lot of the things you can see is where there's irrigation, where are there irrigation wells, which properties are being are extracting groundwater. And then of course, the bottom end of the watershed is urbanized, and you can see what's going on in those areas. And if we had the ability to look back in time, if you download the app, you could scroll back in previous years and actually see when different areas were developed, taken out of agricultural production, and maybe new neighborhoods were put in, or some levels of development were going on. There's another feature I want to point out, and you can barely see it here, but it's right here. See this kind of line, and it goes around like this. Now remember, this is the terminal moraine, and this is a gap in the moraine, and this actually was a historic old distributary channel, probably when the glaciers were first retreating, and we'll see that in some other photos moving forward, and talk a little bit about what you can learn from features like that. So a couple of moraines, a lot of agricultural development, a lot of irrigated agricultural development. Those are the things that we're learning by looking at these aerial photos here. So let's go back down in again a little bit and look. Remember this area right here, right next to the road. You'll see that later as well. The other thing you have on Google Earth that we don't have because this is an online version is in the bottom corner here, it actually gives you a relative elevation. So, and it follows where your little mouse is. So if you took your mouse on the app version and moved up, knowing that this is a hill, you'll see the elevation rising. So that gives you some clues. And all these tools are very general, so don't take them too precisely. The other neat thing about Google Earth, when you start looking at places like this, here's a forested area, but what are all these lines through here? Well, that's a pine plantation, right? So they planted all the trees in rows, and you have evidence of that through there. So you can see natural features, you can see human features, and if you get used to it, you can start to understand how water moves in different areas. Let's look right here again. So you have some trees going on and the river coming through here, but also some of this green here. That is either reed canary grass or most likely sedge meadow habitat. What that tells you then is that's a really wet portion in this area right here, because when you have this type of vegetation, it's got to be real wet. Even reed canary grass doesn't grow in that very, very wet stuff. This is mostly reed canary grass in here, which is telling you that's a little bit drier than this area right next to the creek. And of course, you can see ponds, and there's another pond here that someone had developed. You can also, did I mention that you can also print the photos out? You can save PDFs of whatever's on your screen in Google Earth, and then print them out as well. And for some reason, it just froze up on me. So hopefully we're done with this, and we'll go to the next item here. So the next really important web tool is on the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources website. It's called the Surface Water Data Viewer. And there's tons of information you can get on this website. So let's scroll on in, go back down to Little Plover River Watershed and see what we can see. And here you have on the left side, pluses and minuses. So let's see if we can scroll on in here. Move it up a little bit, get the river in a little bit more. So let's start with a little, panned out view. Here's a Wisconsin River here, moving on through. This actually is a Little Plover River right here, this tinky little thing. So we'll move in a little closer there. So we know already that there's a terminal moraine going on right here and a smaller moraine right here. So the river itself is flowing from here. This is Kennedy Avenue, that road that we looked at before, and these are the features that we saw. So on the Surface Water Data Viewer, just a wealth of information, and we're just going to cover some of the basics today. One thing we're not going to do on this presentation is, explore all the bells and whistles. I would encourage you, if you think these are useful tools, to get on these things and just play around and find out what you can learn. So the first thing I do when I go onto this site is click on the Show Layers button, and that tells you what you're able to turn on and off on this mapping tool. And it starts out with what they call the base map features. So just the roads and surface water and cities and things. So if we clicked on cities, roads, and boundaries, if we click that off, then we'd lose that. So see, they're all gone. I like to have them on because it helps orient me on where I am in the real world. So oftentimes I'll keep these base map features on. But let's explore what's available on a site like this. So here's surface water, and I just clicked on it. It added a few things, but remember on the base map, it also has surface water. So those things were kind of preloaded, but you can look down at different things and understand what you're seeing. So let's go down and look at something here called Streams Natural Communities. Okay, now that turned the Little Plover River purple. Why did it turn the Little Plover River purple? Well, to find out, let's go up to what they call the Show Legend. Click on that, and here's the Streams Natural Communities section that we just turned on, and it tells you what the different colors mean. So in this situation, the purple indicates that this is a cold water stream or creek or river. And in Wisconsin, then if you have a cold water resource like this, it's mostly groundwater fed, because that's where our cold water is. It gets too hot in the summer to have, generally speaking, cold water streams fed by too much surface water. And Little Plover River certainly is. It's probably 80 or 90% of its flow comes from groundwater resources. So that's one thing you see. I like to keep this on because it shows the river so well. So then we'll go back to the Show Layers section and scroll around and see what's also available. Now, the other important thing when you're thinking about restoring a watershed, or restoring a wetland or doing something in an area, you want to understand the watershed boundaries and what's going on with the watershed itself. So here's a watershed button. So if we click on that, that opens, see all these lines came in. These are some watershed boundaries. Now these are what they call the Huck 10 watershed boundaries. Huck means hydrologic unit code. And you can see right here, the 10 means there's 10 numbers in the code. So the rule with the Huck numbers is you can get smaller and smaller watersheds down to sub-watersheds, etc. And the smaller you get, the larger the number is, because each number is a subset of a larger watershed. So the Huck 10 means that this watershed is described with a 10-digit number. And you can see the watershed goes up in here and includes the larger Plover River and some other areas in here. Now, Little Plover River is a sub-watershed of this Huck 10. So how do we get the boundaries of the Little Plover River sub-watershed? So for that, you're going to want to go down here and click, open up the hydrologic units tab, and click here where it says 12-digit HUCs. Okay, and to get rid of the busyness, I'll take off the 10-digit HUC labels. So it's a little lighter here, but you can see the Wisconsin or Little Plover River watershed goes around here, up and down and through here. And if you count the numbers here, there's 12 numbers describing this watershed. Now, the interesting thing here when you're looking at this is a watershed is an area of land. The surface water flow in that area then all drains to a single point. And in this, it all drains down into the river and ultimately into the Wisconsin River. Now, remember what we talked about, though. Remember, there's a terminal moraine right here. And we showed that feature that's this feature that I said could have been an old channel from maybe even glacial times. Well, this feature, if you know boots on the ground, doesn't really exist anymore, even though it's shown on the map. That's why I say these are, the mapping tools are not perfect, and you have to be out and understand what's going on the land, not just go off a map information when you're trying to do some planning, thinking about what you're doing. So when we've got a terminal moraine right here, a huge chunk of this watershed actually does not have surface flow running into the Little Plover River here. Well, why is that part of the watershed then? This probably, from a surface water standpoint, this is probably more of a closed basin. Water doesn't surface flow out of the upper portion of this water. But remembering that this is a cold water resource, 80 to 90% of the water is groundwater fed. What we do know from other studies that this area does contribute, very importantly, the groundwater that feeds the Little Plover River and keeps it healthy. So this is the watershed. This is the area within which we're doing our work, the HUC 12 watershed. We'll keep that tab on. And there's just a whole host of other types of information here. Monitoring sites and data. You've got where are your boat landings and access points, and all kinds of stuff on a site like this. So play around with it, turn things on, turn things off, and if you're wondering what things are, then you go to the show legend and look at that. And there's a lot of things you can print off what you have. You can save PDFs, just like with Google Earth. You can do a lot of different things there. Dams and floodplains, where are all those on here? So you get a lot of information that we won't go into too much detail on right now. Assessments, priority navigable waterways, some interesting things on the fisheries management where they're specifically doing different things, sediment inventories. Let's go to this thing here called mapped wetlands. Take a look at what we've got there. So what we're doing now is we're clicking on the mapped wetlands layer. So the DNR for many years has been using aerial photography and mapping the current wetlands on the landscape using aerial photograph interpretation. And what this is then, it shows the results of that aerial photo interpretation. So let's scroll way on in to this area we were looking at and see what kind of wetlands we might have in this area. So I'm hitting the plus button, just moving closer and closer. Now remember the features we talked about. This is Kennedy Avenue here. This is that little area with the drainage ditch. Remember, we come down and it goes this way. And this is the Little Plover River, very top of the headwaters, right next to this ditch. It crosses and it goes on down. This is that feature that's that old ancient channel that's mostly buried now, but it still shows up on the map. And then you have some of the channels forming. So what you're seeing here is, remembering that this is where the terminal moraine is, and a lot of the spring development that occurs on a moraine is right at the base of the moraine. That's this area right here. So what you have is an abundance of spring-fed headwater wetlands, literally feeding water into the Little Plover River and allowing it to maintain its cold water status. And if you looked up, on the fisheries end of it, it would tell you that this is a class 1 trout stream, and you can play with all those things. You'll learn about fisheries resources in these areas here. So another thing, and we'll stay with the wetlands for a minute, but I want to turn on another feature here before we do, and that's at the bottom. It's called the air photos. So we've got regular map view right now, but if you wanted to use aerial photo view, you click that button and voila, there it is. So here we can see the forested area of the moraine, and at the base of the moraine are these currently identified wetlands. And remember, the wetland layer here is from photography interpretation. It does not necessarily match exactly if you were out on the ground and looking at where the wetlands were in the real world. So use all these types of tools with that in mind, that these are estimates and really good guesses, and they're pretty darn accurate most of the time, but not necessarily 100%. So let's move in a little bit closer here, and you see all the wetlands, and there's different names in each one. So if you click on it, it'll tell you some information about what kind of wetland it is. Here, wetland classification, forested. And that goes back to the 12-point Huck. So that gives you information on that. So that one is forested. This one is not a wetland. So this reed canary grass field has not been mapped as a wetland. This area here is mapped as a forested shrub scrub. This area here is mapped as an emergent wet meadow. And knowing this area, it's mostly reed canary grass. Interestingly enough, this area here that's probably just about as wet did not make it on the map. Along the river here, forested wetlands as well. And remember how dense the forests are in this area, as we identified when we looked at the Google Earth maps. Now, the second thing about the mapped wetlands is when you're thinking about wetland restoration and actually about hydrologic restoration, or trying to fix the water, restore things in your watershed, you want to ask yourself 3 questions. One is, how did this place function historically? How did the water move through this area historically? Number 2, what's changed? What have we done to alter that historic flow and those historic conditions? And number 3, then, what can we do? What are our opportunities in a modern context to bring some semblance of historic conditions back? So when we're thinking about this area here, we talked about it a little bit. How did this place function historically? Well, we found out that here are the current wetlands. We know that there's abundant groundwater coming out at the base of the moraine, feeding this whole area here. We know that there's several different types of wetlands. In terms of the what's changed feature, we know that an agricultural ditch was dug through here, taking water down here, literally allowing a lot of the groundwater flow that comes into the river to bypass the upper portion of the river and go around this bend and dump into the river here. So that's clear. So that's something that's happened. The other thing we can look at thinking about the what's changed is, well, is this all the wetlands there ever was in this area, or has there been wetland loss occurring here? And by gosh, we can find that out on the surface water data viewer as well. So if we go down to this area that says wetland indicators and soils, open that menu up and click on that menu there, and we'll go on to a thing called potentially restorable wetlands. If we open that, this shows you in red where through a lot of different means, especially by looking at the soil types, where wetlands used to be in this landscape. So the orange is the wetlands today, and the red, obviously the orange are wetlands were there in the past as well, but the wetlands that we have lost are covered by these red polygons. So that gives you a really good idea of how this place used to look. And you can click on some of them and it highlights and it tells you the acreage of this potentially restorable wetland, or this wetland from the past, is 123 acres. Now, the origin of the phrase potentially restorable wetland comes from looking at areas that have wetland conditions, historic indications that wetlands were there. And it was kind of a human judgment saying looks like this is an area where if people wanted to bring back wetland conditions, they could do it. So it's not every lost wetland in the state, but it's most of them. And it's ones that, you know, we think physically may be rehydrated and brought back in a way that maybe not perfectly, but could go back into wetland. Now, the historic wetlands that aren't considered potentially restorable wetlands are things like underneath concrete, you know, like downtown Milwaukee, some of those places that are under a city now. It's not there's no reasonable expectations that those could be restored, so they didn't get added to the potentially restorable wetlands list, even though they were historically wetlands. So that's just a little nuance. But these are super useful in helping understand what went on here. Look at the extent of wetlands through here and the extent of wetlands beyond what's left now. And how did we lose these wetlands? Mostly through drainage and tiling. And you can see even right up here above this drain area, this was a wetland area. And that's important because we'll look at that in a minute. We did a big restoration project in here, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is in a few minutes. Now, the other thing that I like to do sometimes is turn off the current wetland layer. So then you can just see where the wetlands used to be, because sometimes it gets pretty busy having them all on. And sometimes there's a little overlap. I'm not always quite sure why there's overlap on them, but sometimes there is. Maybe it's just remnants of mapping features. So on and off, it helps you understand where the wetlands were. Now remember, look at the wetlands come all the way down through here at the base of the Moraine, all the way in here. And look at how forested this area is. Remember when we were talking about when areas are really wet, it's hard to grow trees. And this area up here also even shows as current wetland, but remembering that we've probably lost the hydrology. And this is an important point to remember. Just because something is still considered a wetland doesn't mean it's a healthy wetland or a wetland that's in the same condition as it was historically. So this is a good example right here where it's showing a forested wetland. This big drainage ditch here is probably not totally dried this area up, but dried it up enough to allow a different type of vegetation to grow here. In other words, more forested types that require less wet conditions. And we know there's red maple and things like that in here just from being on site. So that we'll be looking at some of the historic conditions and how we can find out what the vegetation was here in a few minutes. But those are some of the things you can find with the surface water data viewer, and the current wetlands and the potentially restorable wetlands, incredibly important. Now, the other thing you want to understand as you're doing this type of work is what are the soil types? So can we get soil information off this site as well? And the answer is yes. To do that, we want to click on the soils data and open that. And let's see, now I got to remember how we do this. We open up the maximum extent wetlands feature, which is, let's find, there it is right there. So we want to have this open. So the maximum extent wetlands, I'm not quite sure, you could look up in the legend, and there's a lot of information talking about these things on this site that'll tell you what they mean. So here we are, let's look at this site right here. It has this RM on it, and you can see that this is one soil type all through here, what they're calling RM, and this is that drainage ditch that we were looking at right here. All this area north of the drainage ditch is shown as potentially historic wetlands. So let's click on it. And if we scroll down, we can look at the soil type. So according to the surface water data viewer, this is Roscommon muck in this area here. And if you want to then look up this wetland soil here, then you can go and exit and go to this NRCS soil report site. So let's do that. Remember, they mapped this as Roscommon muck on the surface water data viewer. So this takes you to the web soil survey page, and what you want to do is start WSS. So start a new session. I don't know, I must have been playing with this earlier and it had me on as a session. So once again, you get a very large map, and you want to use the button here to scroll into where we want to be. And so I just keep clicking on this, and it gets closer and closer and closer to the Little Plover River. Scrolling on in, scrolling on in. When we start to get close, you know it because you can see this moraine and this little T-shaped forested area in an ocean of agricultural landscape. So we're getting closer here. So let's bring all the way back on in close to, and we want to know what the soil types are in this area here. Oops, up, 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 went a little too far. Well, that's looking real close. So let's go back a little bit. Remember, we were looking at the soil types in this area right here. So, and when you go on the site, you can read about how to navigate it, but we're not going to spend time doing that. What they want you to do first is identify the area of interest. And to do that, and it's some of these sites are not the most user-friendly, and it took me a while to figure out how to identify the area of interest. So you click on that little button that says AOI, and then you just make a rectangle, and there you've created your AOI. So we're in an area here, and we want to look at the soil types here. So then we go up to this top tab that says soil map, click on that, and here we go. The orange lines show the different soil type boundaries. And remember, we were in here wondering what kind of soil is this? On the surface water data viewer, it said it was Roscommon muck. Here it says something else. It says an NW, and why this font is so small, I don't know. But you go over here and find NW on this map, and it's right here. And it's calling it Newsome Mucky Loamy Sand Soil. So what this is telling you, what the soil survey is showing is not what the surface water data viewer is showing. So there's an actual error on the surface water data viewer. They're calling it the wrong soil type in this area. And I learned this by experience because I was calling it Roscommon muck when we first started our planning out here, and I was corrected by soil folks. So you click on that, and then you get a whole description of this type of soil and all kinds of information in here. Always remember, understanding the soil conditions is paramount before you even start thinking about what can be done in terms of wetland restoration. So how the water's moving, what's changed, and what's going on with the soil, because the soil tells you a lot about the possibilities and what was here in the past. So we know this is a Newsome mucky loam, and then the profile is real interesting here. 0 to 1 inches, high decomposed plant material, 1 to 3 mucky loamy sand. When you get below that, 3 to 8 just says loamy sand. So it's a fairly shallow, very shallow muck. Really, the muck is only in the first few inches of the soil profile. Then it goes from loamy sand right down to sand. You're 8 inches down, and it's just pure sand. So that tells you one thing. Drainage, of course, is poorly drained, frequency of flooding, frequent, or ponding frequent. And we know that. Remember these sites when we looked in the earlier on the Google Earth, we saw those areas where the crops wouldn't grow. That's these dark areas. Why is that? Because it's a mucky soil prone to ponding. And so every time it rains, there's a pond of water right there. It can't soak down into the ground, so it's hard to grow crops. So these are the types of things you can find. And is it a hydric soil right here? Hydric soil rating, yes, under interpretive groups. So you know if it's a hydric soil, then that's the best indication that at one time in the past, this was a wetland. So let's look at right next door to this. We found out this was a very shallow muck, less than a foot thick. Let's look at this one here. And this is MARA, right next door to it, but closer to the moraine. MARA, Markey Muck Acid Lake Plain. Click on that and see what we can find out there. So you scroll down, you can see all the things and look at the profile. 0 to 8 inches muck. 8 to 33 inches muck. By the time you get below that, it starts to go to mucky sand, and you're almost 4 feet down before it even gets to sand. And I'll attest to that. I was up here a couple weeks ago into that area, and I took a wrong step and I went up to my thighs in muck, and I didn't hit bottom. So it's a deep, deep muck there, which is interesting because you know then that there's probably upwelling water creating those muck conditions. Once again, hydric rating, of course it's hydric, and landform fens on outwash plains. So that makes sense. Fens meaning groundwater fed areas here. So a lot of information you can get on the soils. So that was the web survey that was using the surface water data viewer to find out soil information at the site we were at. So let's go back to where we were. We're back to this, I think we know it's not Roscommon muck, so we'll click that off. And so this gives you an idea then what's happened in the area here. So let's think about what we've learned so far. We have a cold water river, the Little Plover River, which tells us that it's mostly groundwater fed. We have a moraine and some wetlands at the base of the moraine that the soils have shown that they're fen dominated, they're dependent on spring flow. We also have a landscape that has lost a lot of wetlands below that moraine. And we've learned that there's some pretty heavy forest and tree growth along some of these areas that used to be called wetlands. So what is that telling us? That we've probably got a much drier landscape than we had historically out here. And that then gives us ideas on, well, if we want to restore this area, how can we make it more wet? What are our options? So we're starting to understand the disturbances that have occurred in this area here. So please explore the surface water data viewer area, and we'll go on to our next tool. Let me close off a couple of websites that we're done with so we don't get too busy.
And while you're doing that, Tracy, we got a question about how often the data in the surface water data viewer is updated, and also whether it comes from swims. And
Good
I can
question. If you can answer, go for it. Yeah, I'll call up the next website.
Right. So I work for the DNR, for folks who don't know. So and I did actually check with some folks to answer this question. And it sounds like the data that's coming from swims, a lot of it is updating nightly or fairly regularly. If you had a question about a specific layer, you could go ahead and ask that. But long story short, the data is updated on a regular basis, particularly the information from swims.
All right. And there's abundant phone numbers and contact information. So when you're working these websites, there's always usually a human being that you can reach out to for questions.
Yes.
And what you're getting today is a pretty basic view of some of the information out on these things from someone that's a fairly technophobe. By the time we're in our late 50s, we're not as tech savvy as some of the others. And that, I think, is one of the reasons Eric wanted me to do this, because some of the younger folks whip through these things so quickly, and it's not always clear on what's going on. So next one we're going to look at is a thing called Wetlands by Design. And the way to get on that is go to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources website and type in Wetlands by Design in their search function. And you get that, and then you see right at the top, Wetlands by Design, click on that. And you'll get to a PDF that explains what Wetlands by Design is and talks a lot about how it was formed, how to use it, on and on and on and on. So the reason I'm going in this direction to get to this site is because I want you to read that. If you're going to use this this tool, please read this PDF and learn the possibilities here. So easy way to get to it then is just click on, see here we are on the intro page II, Wetlands and Watersheds Explorer. That's an easy way to, you'll have it bookmarked once you get there. But then we get to this website, Wisconsin Waters, Wetlands and Watersheds. And this is another basic tool that is designed to help you understand how wetlands were working in your area. So let's go start scrolling down. Remember where we are. And this one especially breaks down wetlands in terms of function. We often think about wetlands in terms of wildlife habitat and fisheries habitat and things. This is one designed to help you understand the functions. So start exploring wetlands by design, a watershed approach. Click go right here. This gets you the basic features. The other one has to do with some wildlife tools that they have that we're not going to talk about today, just because of the time. So scroll on in. Here we are getting closer to Plover. And here's our river right here. You can barely see it, but let's click on that. And it brings you to a Huck 8. Remember, the smaller the number of the hydrologic unit code, the bigger the watershed is. So we want to go inside this Huck 8 and explore down closer. So here's the watershed we want. Click on that. It brings us down and it breaks the Huck 10. That was the Huck 10 watershed. It breaks it down into the Huck 12s. And remember this goofy looking shape? That's our Little Plover River watershed. So let's click on that. Brings us close on in. And it takes a minute to load sometimes. So here, this tool is very interesting. It takes well, first of all, I'll say that this tool was developed by the Department of Natural Resources in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy. And TNC is great at developing web-based tools. So you'll see a lot of TNC tools to help with these types of planning activities. And so here we are in this spot that we know so well because we've been looking at it through other things. Here's the terminal moraine, and here are in the red colors are the potentially restorable wetlands we saw on the last site, and the green are the currently mapped wetlands sites. So the neat thing about Wetlands by Design, and once again, it's a website tool. There's no substitute for boots on the ground and understanding your watershed, but this is a real general tool that helps you think, well, what are the problems in my watershed? Let's say that flooding was a problem in this watershed. We could look around at the functions that wetlands provide and say, well, we know wetlands are good at holding floodwaters. Where in my watershed, which wetlands would be good at those functions? That's what this tool does. Helps you choose a function, say, which wetlands are most effective at addressing certain problems that we have. So let's find flood abatement right here. This right here says flood abatement. So if we click on the choose service to compare sites, click on the flood abatement, and it gives you, using relative colors, which wetlands are more or less important in terms of being useful for flood abatement. So here we're showing these wetlands are considered high or very high. If you click on the wetland itself, it'll give you information just for that polygon. And so this linear wetland that we have here, it tells you all how it rated on the different surfaces. So flood abatement, it was high, fish and wildlife habitat high, phosphorus retention very high, and on down the line. Some of the things are moderate. Not a lot of shoreline protection there because we're not on a lake. So you can scroll through and click different where's our carbon storage wetlands? Boom, that's there. And those are based on the amount of muck soil, right? Muck is really good at storing carbon. What about floristic integrity? Things like that. So nitrogen reduction, which is a big issue in this area. If we want to restore wetlands to help reduce nitrogen, then we want to look at the potentially restorable parts of this map and see what are the darkest red. Well, maybe these, if we have a nitrogen problem, maybe we want to concentrate in some of these areas, and maybe not so much, up here or in some of these areas that aren't as dark. Helps concentrate your thinking and get you get you more organized. Now, if we move way in closer, we'll look at our old sites again, and it's hard to show because I don't see the water courses on here, but this is that area that we were showing before. We're the very top of the river, and this is that agricultural drain that cut down and dumped into the river here. So you can see that this area here would be very important if we wanted to do nitrogen reduction. And it even tells you the acreage of that polygon. So this area here is 77 acres. So you can play around with these different things and learn in a very general way. And once again, take it as a useful tool, but not as gospel truth. One of the problems with web-based tools is they can look pretty sophisticated, and we come out with some pretty detailed maps. And our brains work in a way that if we see something that looks really detailed like this, we attribute it to more truthful. And it's all about the data that it's built upon and things like that. And a lot of this is aerial photo interpretation. So use them as a tool, use them as a basic planning guide, but know the land, get out there on the ground, get your boots muddy. And I will once again, encourage you to explore this tool and play with it. There's a lot of things you can do in here. And if you have questions about this, reach out to TNC and WDNR. So let's go to the next online tool and start looking about what if we wanted to see what some of these areas looked like historically. And the State Cartographer's Office is great. You can get a lot of information with aerial photos on this site. So here we want to go to the quick link, Wisconsin Aerial Photography Catalog. Let's click on that. And we get a map of the state. So we're interested in Portage County, aren't we? So we click on that and go over here. It says search. Click on the search. And we get a whole list of aerial photo libraries that have been taken in Portage County, going all the way back to the fall of 1938, summer of 48, on and on and on. It goes all the way down, moving up into literally the spring of 2015. And when you click on that, you get all these counties. You can say, well, I'm interested in looking at these photos from the fall of 1938. And here you'll see there's a button here. If you click on that, it says search and free download. Okay, we're going to go back to that in a second. What if I wanted summer of 1948 and the source is Portage County? I'd click on that. And what does it tell you? It gives you some other information. It doesn't say free download, does it? But it does give you a human being you can talk to, Jeff Hartman. It gives you his phone number and his email. And a link to the county website, a link to the county mapping site, and even the GIS download site. Doesn't look like the photos are available like they may be in the 1938 series. And we'll click on the 38 series in a minute. But I just wanted to call attention to you all that some very, very detailed and good information can be gleaned from the county websites. So really explore what's available, and every county is different. Some counties are much more sophisticated than others, and get to know what's going on. You got property lines, you got all kinds of wealth of information that we're not going to go into today's journey, but I would encourage you to really, if you're looking at an area, that visit the county websites. So let's start out with this 1938 fall aerial photo. And we'll search on the search and free download and see where that takes us. Oh, once again, we get a picture of the state. And let's see if we can go down to Portage County, and we'll use our little plus arrow. Luckily, Portage County is right in the middle of the state, so it's usually easy to get right to. We're getting closer in, closer in, closer in. We're starting to see that the sideways T, right? Here's that Moraine, here's the Little Plover River. Let's get a little bit closer. So what we're looking at now is white dots on an aerial photo map. And each of these dots is an aerial photo taken in the fall of 1938. Generally, what they did is they flew transects north and south and took photos, fairly evenly as they went, and the photos overlap. Must have been a little windy because this one is a little offline, isn't it? So let's scroll in a little bit closer. I also want to point out something before we go. And in the Google Earth, one thing I didn't tell you is that's not the most current photo oftentimes. I think the photo that's being used on Google Earth for this area right now is from 2017, whereas this photo is actually current as of this year. Now let's look at this area we've been at. And remember, we talked about this agricultural drain. Here's the moraine here, all these wetlands on the edge. Here's the very tippy top of the Little Plover River. And this was that agricultural drain that goes down over and bypasses the river. And this area here, and remember, we saw this big drain in here. That looks a little different, doesn't it? Well, the reason is we did a restoration project on this site about 1.5 years ago. What we ended up doing is literally filling in that big deep drain from the point here where my hand is all the way down to Kennedy Avenue and this middle ditch right here. So now all the groundwater that's expressing itself out here is not being sucked away by this agricultural ditch. And any water that's coming down this ditch now is when it hits the top of the fill, there's a spillway that directs it right into the top of the river itself. And it's been wonderful. We've probably increased the flow in the upper watershed, or the upper mile of Little Plover River channel almost 17-fold. In other words, all the water that used to be lost in the ditch is now in the river itself. And it's interesting to watch the changes because it's so wet now. The vegetation over time will be changing, and it's going to be fun to watch it change itself. The other interesting thing that I didn't talk about, and here you can see these dark areas on these photos oftentimes give you a real good indication that maybe those are wetland soils as well. This drainage ditch starts here and goes down. Actually, it does cross the road from the north. It comes down through here, but surface flow in this ditch doesn't happen except for usually in the month of March when there's a lot of snow melt. You'll get some water crossing the road here. Otherwise, this ditch is almost 100% intercepting groundwater flow. So when we filled this ditch in here up to this point, the open ditch that we did not fill yet, and maybe it'll be filled in the future, filled right up to the brim and started flowing directly into the river itself. And it was ice cold water, even in the heat of the summer, which tells you this is all groundwater being expressed from the base of the moraine that had been captured and lost by this ditch, now entering the Little Plover River proper. And there's little baby trout swimming around all through there and everything else. So remember looking at remember when we saw the wetland soils, it kind of went down and up. This was the wetland. See how dark that is now that it's been re-wetted. We took some tiles out as well. And now these upland areas are being planted for grass. The other thing we did here is if for some reason there's too much water that comes down this area, we didn't want erosion happening. So we have a bypass spillway that if the drain gets too high, it takes water into the property here and enters the wetland surface flow. And then there's another minor spillway going off the property here to take any extra overflow back down into the river itself. So just some things to handle tough situations. Now, the other thing you'll notice here, look at this area here. Remember how dark that was and how deep and thick that forest was in the Google Earth from 2017. We've had UWSP professor and students out here for a couple of years, thinning this whole area, getting it back to more historic conditions. And I'll show you what those look like in a second, and doing a lot of work to bring health back to the channel itself. So that's why this looks so much more open. It's getting closer to historic conditions. In this area here, remember this site here, we're gonna look at the 1938 aerial photo of this area and compare conditions today to what they were. Now, normally what you would do is you would click on this button and it'll allow you to download, maybe I'm zoomed in a little too much, allows you to download the photo. Yeah, for some reason I must be zoomed in too close. Usually it pops up a little picture, allows you to download the photo. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So, and you can download a small version, a medium version, or a large version. And I always get the large versions because that gives you the most detail as you're scrolling in to look. And it gives you the date. The photo at this site was taken in September 24th, 1938. So I pre-downloaded that, but I can't do it the way we're set up. So I'll have to open this up. Oops. We'll have to open that up and look at it here. So here's this area, 1938, same area. Here's the Moraine, here's the Little Plover River, and it looks very different than it did back, than it does today. Looks very different than it did before. Now, even by 1938, remember, we've done a lot of alterations. The roads were already put in. Here's Kennedy Avenue, it was in 38, the road to the north. This drainage ditch was already in place by 1938. You can see here's the middle part, and in that area, this area was being farmed. What we didn't have in 1938 was a lot of irrigation development. So you'll see a landscape that is not subject to the large amount of irrigation removal that we have today. And that's another reason why these aerial photos are so nice to look at. So let's start out by looking at the very tippy top. Remember, here's the very top of the Little Plover River, and look at the vegetation here. Here's the hill of the Moraine, thicker forest. What's going on here? We can move in a little bit closer. These are shrubs or trees. I mean, not trees, shrubs or meadow plants. So this is showing you that back in 38, even with the ditch in, this place was so wet, it wasn't allowing the growth of trees that are growing there today. And of course, we have the cropland in here and in the wetland areas. You can see these are hay piles. So this whole area was hayed. I'm sure the wetland was hayed way back in the day. Here we're seeing, which is probably tussock sedge, probably grass and sedge meadow wetlands. They were able to hay some of these areas in here at the time. And so let's go downstream a little bit and let's pan out just to. Here's that area that now was such thick forest. There was no forest in there back in 1938. The other thing you can see is a lot of, remember in the surface water data viewer, we saw that this was a big historic wetland that has been lost now. You can see features in the 30s where they had been digging ditches to help drain this area here for crop production. So a lot of stuff went on back then to get these properties farmable. You can see some old channels now that are almost impossible to see today, showing these dark areas where there had been water either flowing surface wise or underwater or underground through this area here. And once again, these were probably those old channels that existed at the end of the glacial. These were glacial runoff channels. And a testimony to that is the guy that lives here, his name's Joe Pavelski. And I was talking to him one day about this feature, and he says, oh yeah, that's the underground river. Even the landowners up there understand that water moves underground through this area, because he had to dig a pond and he knew that he had to put it in the right location to avoid what he's calling his underground river. So another source of information on an area, of course, are the people that have lived there for all their lives, or especially if families have been there for generations. So remember that other feature I showed you early on that came down the moraine and took an angle right off going up this direction? There it is, 1938. And what that is, and it's almost all gone now, it's not a transmission line, it's an old small scale railroad track. And so way back when, before 38, there must have been some logging going on, and they developed this track it was probably only used for a very short period, because it doesn't look like it's in place now. But when you're walking along this landscape up in this area, you can still see remnants of the old track. That the rails are gone, but the bed is elevated in certain areas. You can tell it's a railroad bed. So it's kind of a neat little piece of history that knowledge of it is gone, but we can see evidence of it looking at the sites. So remember that old distributory channel that goes down here, and if you look at the photo to the bottom, you can really see it. In 1938, it came out really well. So the point here is we're finding out that this area was devoid mostly of forest conditions. This was very, very, very wet, so wet that we couldn't get trees growing. Now the stuff you're seeing real close to the river is likely things like tag alder and stuff like that. So we're in a very different landscape now. It's dry enough where the trees are starting to grow again. And as you go downstream, you see you're getting thicker vegetation because the conditions have changed. Here, we're in this area that is so close to the moraine. It's all upwelling groundwater historically. This place was just soaking wet. And we'll go to another site if we have time to go even further back in time to look at the conditions here. So the story we were able to pull out is that this was, big, probably grass sedge meadow historically. Agricultural developments with drainage and things losing the wetlands allowed this area to become drier. That changed the vegetation, and trees started growing up, and a lot of things happened with that. Part of what happened was with the shade in that area, it changed the way the river channel was functioning. In other words, the grasses that used to hold the banks along the river, the grasses were not allowed to grow there because it was too shaded, and that created unstable conditions. So having an agricultural drain moving water swiftly through here created peak flashier floods on Little Plover River. The drier conditions creating the trees did not allow the growth of the bank holding vegetation that really can help keep the bank stable, and the whole thing fell apart. And the end result was a few years ago is this channel was very wide and unstable and full of sand, and not the best trout habitat that we would like. So all these clues that we learned as we were understanding what's changed and what existed historically was very important in helping us understand what we can do, what needs to be done to restore it.
Tracy, there was a question about the area you were just describing.
Yes.
Are there areas where there's been sand quarried for fracking?
Not in this area, no. There's a little bit of pond development, but those are mostly, I think, people trying to dig duck ponds or something that they thought, maybe they were trying to put some fish in a little pond. So, even though it is a big sand area, I think the quality of the frac sand is better more in the driftless area. There's a couple of sand layers there. All right, well, let's go on to the next site. And once again, just the more you explore and work with aerial photos, the more you learn, and seek out folks that do a lot of this type of work. And it's amazing the kind of stuff you can see. I can spend hours and hours looking over these 1930s photos and just pouring over inch by inch. It's really fun. Okay, so the next thing we want to go back is a step further. And before we do that, we want to go to this site. Sometimes the best way to find information is to understand where you are in terms of the township range and section grid on the land. And if you don't know what your township range and section is in the areas, there's ways to find it. And this little Earth Point site is a nice little way to get that information put onto your Google Earth as a Google Earth layer. And I won't do that today because I've already got it, but you literally click on BLM grid and click on view on Google Earth. And it will, when you open your Google Earth, it'll put the lattice work of the sections on your, and you can click it on or click it off. And if you click in the middle of the section, it tells you what your township range and section is for your location. So that's super useful, especially when you're looking at the next bit of information we will be exploring, which is the government GLO surveys right here. This is a really neat website. This is the website showing the notes from the people that originally platted out Wisconsin, well, the whole nation, and broke everything up into bite-sized, square mile chunks. And while they were doing that, they also described what they were seeing on the land, because they were trying to determine, are they looking at land that's developable? Can we grow crops on it, or what? And so part of the purpose of the GLO surveys was that. So let's look real quickly at what we can get here. Land survey information. And I would ask you to read all this stuff. It's fascinating. It's really important. If you don't know much about the GLO surveys, explore this website and understand what went on and when it happened. It all happened, in the 1830s through 1860s in Wisconsin. And so you can find a lot of stuff there. So what we want to do here is click on the search method here and find out if there's any information where we are doing our work in Portage County. And we didn't do it because I already had, but the township range section that we were just looking at previously is Township 23 North, Range 8 East, Section 13. So let's type in our search, go down to Township 23 North, Range 8 East. There we are right there, and Section 13. Do a search, find out what's available. So here are the actual handwritten notes by the surveyors as they walked these areas and platted out the lines. And you can open up, you can see maps in the area, and many places they drew, here's the Wisconsin River, here's Little Plover River. They don't even call it Little Plover River, they call it Springbrook, and so things like that. So you can find that kind of information up here. And you can also find the detailed notes by the surveyors themselves. So the one we're going to look at real quickly is this one that says section line, Township 23-8, Section 13, East Boundary. Now, luckily, this Kennedy Avenue is the east boundary of Section 13, and that just so happens to be the township boundary. And so oftentimes on the township boundaries, they would walk and do more detailed, take more detailed survey notes. So let's open this one up. And this is from May 1851 through June 1851, sometime in that area. And you can see there's other notes in this area between 1839. So a lot of this stuff happened before there was any development. So this is, kind of eyewitness accounts of what the landscape looked like, and they would describe it. So here you click on that and you get literally a scan of the surveyor's notes page, and you can make it bigger or smaller depending. So this is interesting because he was literally walking right down what is now Kennedy Avenue and measuring distance, and of course it's all in rods and stuff. And when you read the information on the site, it tells you how to interpret a lot of this stuff. And he's talking about what's going on. So as he's going down at this measurement 36, he's entering an alder swamp, walking from north to south. He set a post for the section corner, blah, 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 white pine, aspen, leaves the alder swamp and enters a marsh, too wet for cultivation, as well as the swamp. And he leaves the marsh and enters the alder swamp. And so he goes down and he's talking about, as he goes, what's going on. One interesting thing here is he says, juniper pine damaged by fire north of swamp. Well, that gives you an indication that maybe fire was a factor in this landscape. Another really interesting thing here was he finally gets down to Little Plover River channel itself, and he calls it a brook. Brook 8 lengths wide, muddy bottom, runs, and I'm not quite sure what that means, to the west. Must mean to the west. And then he talks after he leaves that, you know, by 1750, he left the alder swamp, blah, blah, blah. 8 lengths. So Little Plover River in 1851 was 8 lengths wide. That's about 5.5 feet. So that was a really important piece of information for us when we were starting to look at this river at this section a few years ago. 5.5 feet wide. So if you understand wetlands and rivers and a lot of these things, it makes a lot of sense when you start putting all these pieces together. The lack of the trees, the wet, deep, mucky soils, all this stuff made sense to have a narrow, windy channel winding through literally a very, very flat wet meadow grass upper watershed wetland situation. And when we started this Little Plover River project, you go to the river at this point, which used to be 5.5 feet wide historically, and it was literally 30 to 40 feet wide, and so shallow, you hardly ever went deeper than shin deep when you'd be walking across the channel again. So putting all these factors together, we started to piece together what caused the problems here. You know, the removal of groundwater from all this irrigation, the drain changing the way water flowed, the flashiness because of the drains, the vegetation that grew in because the land became drier, shading out the grasses that used to hold the bank, you know, on and on and on. And you start to understand how this place looked historically, what's changed, and then that helps guide what you might want to do for restoration. So explore these things. Sometimes they're really hard to read. This guy actually had really nice handwriting. This is one of the few ones that's much easier to read than others, but certainly seek out these GLO surveys. Okay, I want to go over one last one before we're done, and that's what they call the Boardner Surveys, another really interesting set of surveys that went on in the 1930s. And once again, you open up the State Cartographer's Office site and you'll find a wealth of information about these surveys, how they were conducted, you know, why. And it was literally, it might have been kind of a jobs maker in the 1930s during the Depression. They got people out literally mapping vegetation communities. So it's really interesting. So if you go to this site, and you go down to digitizing the Boardner maps, there's a little button here that says available online. So we'll click on that and it gets you to the Wisconsin Land Economic Inventory, also known as the Boardner Surveys. Everybody calls them the Boardner Surveys. So let's find our little spot. Go over here on the right where it says browse the collection. Click on that. And you'll get a whole you know, list of things, but you want to find what we're looking for. So let's type in plover and see what we get. So town of Plover Linwood, town of Grant Plover. So because I've done this work previous, I know town of Plover Linwood is the map that we want to look at. So let's open that up. And here you get literally a physical map scan that was created in the 30s. I think it has the date on it. I think it was 1938, same year as that aerial photo. And I think we know that from the previous page. Yeah, it says 1938 right there. So here it is. So let's look at what they've got. How did they describe the vegetation in this area in 1930? Now, remembering that this is also done by sections or townships, and here's the Kennedy Avenue, which was the township line, and here's the Little Plover River itself. So we're getting right up to that area, and this map covers everything west of Kennedy Avenue. So let's use the plus button and scroll in real tight and close and see what we got. Now, remember that train, that old rail line? They even show it as a rail line on here. So another neat feature that was pretty much lost by a lot of the locals that even remember that old train line. But here we have along the river here, things that says A4, C4, A4, A4, A4. So what does that mean? There's a oops. There's a key down below. So we had A4 and C4 in that little area west of the road. So A4 is this thing, tag alder, willow, dogwood, etc. Okay, and we remember seeing that in the 38 photos, that those little patches of willows and tag alder. What's the C4? Look at this right here, grass marsh. And the interesting thing is they distinguish between grass marsh and sedge marsh. Sedge marsh has a cap over it. This was identified as a grass marsh, which probably means here it was probably a lot of blue joint grass. And this makes a lot of sense when you start thinking, you know, especially if you're a wetlands person, understanding this area here. And so another resource that helps you see literally what was mapped down here at another point in time in a way that helps you interpret what you're seeing on the aerial photos themselves. So cool stuff. If you didn't know about the Boardner surveys, now you do. And I would encourage you to seek out this information. We're just about out of time. So the other thing, if you're looking at wetland restoration or carrying or watershed work or any of this kind of stuff on the ground, of course, you're going to want to know who can you talk to find help. And I will go back to the beginning where we started, and that's on the Wisconsin Wetlands Association website. Remember, for the landowners, I want to call attention to this thing we're calling our landowner handbook. And this is shameless plug because I'm giving the talk. But a few years ago, we put together a thing called My Healthy Wetland. It's a handbook for wetland owners. A lot of the information that I talked about today in these sites is in this book. But really what this book is it tells you about wetlands and how to know what kind of wetland you have and why it's important. But most of the book is talking about how to think about your approach you need to take for wetland care and restoration. So I would encourage you, if you're going to dive in and do some more wetland stuff, seek out this book. It can be ordered, of course, on our website. So go back to Wisconsin Wetlands Association and download that. The other thing, the other shameless plug I will point out here is this green button here, donate. We are a membership organization. We do a lot of work. We have a very small staff, and a lot of the stuff we do is thanks to the contributions of our membership. Any size donation makes you a member. So if you're interested in wetlands and in Wisconsin wetlands and the work we're doing, I would encourage you to become a member.
All right,
And
Tracy, there's about
questions.
5 minutes left, and there's a couple questions for you here.
All right, let's go for it.
The first one is if you can provide links to all of the web pages you used today, or if there's another place they can find all of these resources quickly.
Perfect question for this site. So go to the 4 landowners, go to the 4 landowners and then go to the resources right here on our website. And most of them are listed down in here.
Fantastic.
And the other thing, if there's something that I talked about that isn't, of course, feel free to send me an email. And we have the about, and there's contact information on our website. So yeah, we certainly, if we covered a lot of different things, and if you didn't get it all down, we're certainly happy to get you connected with that.
All right. And then you sort of answered this indirectly, but we'll go over it again. Is it always better to plan a wetland restoration to habitats as they existed in the past, or in planning for climate change, would adding some plants that can take hotter temps and moisture be an option?
Yeah, what a great question. And the answer is, of course, it depends. But we need to be thinking about that in terms of how we're looking at our situations. And I always really promote ask those 3 questions. How did this place function historically? What's changed? What can we do to bring back some semblance of historic conditions in a modern context. And the modern context is the most important part of that, because there's things that have changed or are changing that we can't easily undo. We're not pulling out all the roads. We're not, getting rid of cities, a lot of things that have affected the way water flows. So that the challenge and the fun of restoration is trying to figure out then what can be done to bring health back to these systems. And sometimes that means you're not able to bring back conditions that existed historically. So you got to think, what's plan B? An example would be maybe a muck farm restoration. A lot of these muck farms talk about climate change. When they were drained, that exposed all that muck to the air, all that carbon re-entered the air. Some of these muck farms have subsided 6 feet in elevation over the last several decades. Well, you're not going to restore that wetland to its original condition, at least in the near term, because it had so much carbon. The soils were 6 feet deeper than or higher up than they are today. So those are the challenges and the things we deal with every day. And climate change is certainly one of those factors that we have to factor in when we're thinking about what's possible and what our goals are for these sites.
All right,
But
I think
I
we
maintain the 3 questions is incredibly important, and take that perspective. And the My Healthy Wetlands Handbook talks about that.
Great. And we got about a minute left, so I think we can squeeze one last question in here of, if you could provide a quick example of how you have used some of the data that you've shown today to make policy decisions.
Good question. Yes. So policy is an evolving thing. And when you're looking at these conditions, and the Little Plover River was a good example, we're having a lot of problems, and going back to climate change throughout the state now with some of these crazy rain events and things that are happening due to changing climate patterns. In places like the Little Plover River, where we've been able to do this kind of work, we're able to take decision makers out there, and we have, and showing them how we can begin to repair and to work on lessening the problems we're having due to these storms. And we're doing a lot of work up in the Superior watershed as well, up near Ashland. And so this kind of stuff, good policy starts with good understanding, and good understanding starts with getting people out in the fields and talking about the conditions. We need to bring back, not only protect the wetlands that we have in this state. We've lost half our wetlands, kids. We need to start bringing back wetlands like in the Little Plover River, where they once existed, if we're ever going to get health back to our fish, wildlife, our biodiversity, and if we're going to protect our roads and things from the effects of high runoff and all this other stuff. Who knew? At first, nobody talked about a runoff problem in Little Plover River. This kind of work showed that there was a runoff issue as well as a groundwater issue. So that's what we do to help move policy forward, is really start with an education and getting people to understand why wetlands are important parts of the solutions to the problems we're having in our state.
All right. Thank you so much, Tracy, for all of that. That was a lot of great
Thank you all
information.
for sitting through an hour and a half of this, and I hope it was useful.
Yeah, yep, I think it was. And so folks know the next big thing you can tune into is the water trivia at 3:30. Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.
And Tracy, there was one other question that I didn't get to. I'm hoping those folks can reach out to you afterwards.
Okay.
It was a pretty specific question, so.
Are we going to go back to the Zoom, or we're in the Zoom, right? Do I stop sharing yet? Has it been long enough?
I would think so. Yep.
Try that. Okay. There you are. Well, there's your name anyways. All right. Well, thank you. That was fun.